What's happening, everybody? Hope you're hanging in there. For today's 261st episode of the Crash Bang Boom podcast, we're mixing it up and talking to the one-man band and industrial sonic phenomenon, Tristan Shone, a.k.a. author and Punisher. We cover all kinds of good stuff ranging from the inspiration behind his visions of amalgamating engineering and music, working with the rhythm section of Tool, what differs on his fantastic new record Kruller from the previous ones, and a whole lot more. And going forward with this podcast, I do plan on speaking to more broad musicians, producers, hell, maybe even extreme athletes. Trying to mix it up after 6 years of 260 episodes, so stay tuned for the ride. It might be a little wild. Today's episode is sponsored by my man Carson Gant, a.k.a. OneUpLoops.com. Carson and his team spend a preposterous amount of time recording over 400,000 shaker, tambourine, and hi-hat loops at every possible tempo and multiple feels with incredible mics and outboard gear for you to pick and choose. It's organized for you to find exactly what you need with just a few clicks and everything feels and sounds incredible. You can sign up for free to check it out and gain full access to all 400,000 loops starting at just $5.99 a month. No download limits, whatever you want, whenever you want. New loops, one-shots, and drum breaks are being recorded weekly. Check it out at OneUpLoops.com. Crash Bang Boom Podcast can be found on iTunes Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Luminary, Google Play, Podbean, and Amazon Music Podcasts, to name a few. Feel free to check out into previous 260-plus episodes and give me a like, a subscription, and or a positive review, as the support is always appreciated. So without further ado, here we go. Author and Punisher, Crash Bang Boom.
Crowds go mad with joy.
All right, I'm here with the one-man industrial sonic explosion-inducing act, Tristan Shone, a.k.a. author and Punisher. Tristan, how's it going, man?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Doing pretty good. Thanks for catching up with me, man. You have definitely been cranking out some really interesting music that has some ties back to some of the industrial stuff that I was seeing maybe in the 90s, and then I just like just sort of the progression of the records. So for one, congratulations on this new one, Kruller. I'd like to talk to you about sort of working with some of the members as Tool, as I understand, on that as well. But initially, in listening to Kruller, it sort of sounds like a little bit brighter to me in its production than previous records, and I'd say that there seems to be maybe more vocal melody as well than some of the previous ones. So I guess in writing it, were there any technical or physical revisions that you made to your setup? Or hell, I mean, how about just mentally where you were at sort of conceiving this during a global pandemic and releasing it just in time for rumblings of World War III? Holy shit, man.
Well, I think it all kind of played into it. You know, when I got back from that tour, I was in a lot had happened. You know, the tour was the biggest tour I'd ever been on, biggest sound systems. I had a crew of people with me. They added on these, Australia and New Zealand dates. So that was kind of like it was a whirlwind. Yeah. And I had my best friends along with me. My wife came along to tour manage. It was kind of like all the great people that had helped me along the way came along with me on that tour, like my sound guy, my other sound guy. Mm-hmm. They did monitors and sound. And then my business partner, Jason Beggin, who helped produce this album. So it was really kind of like, okay, this is a big chance to really do what I do. And so coming back and sitting in the studio and facing down this pandemic, it was an end of an album cycle for me. Uh-huh. So I was already at the point where I was like, okay, I'm going to start writing, even though I still lost 42 shows the rest of that year. Wow. Which was a bummer, but also in some ways I was kind of ready for it. Mm-hmm. I had played the hell out of those songs. Right. And, we recorded all that stuff and I went back and listened to it. And Taylor, who had done sound for me on that tour, edited it all down, and we listened. And I said, there's some things I really liked about this, and there's some things that I think I can improve on. Mm-hmm. Looking at yourself in the mirror, like coming back from a tour and saying, like, okay, you got 2 years. Well, who knows how long, but you've got some time to sort of like evaluate yourself very honestly. And going into mixing and writing this record, that's what I had on my mind. Like Jason and he really helped me improve my ability to make things sound good. And I ended up mixing this whole thing myself with his guidance. Oh, nice. In the past, no discredit to anyone that I've worked with, but they make their own decisions. And this, I'm not the most technically, gifted studio engineer, but I certainly am I I hack away until I get what I want. And I wanted a really lush, thick sound.
Yeah.
And I didn't want anyone to say, oh, no, that's not how you're supposed to technically mix. I was like, no, I'm going to layer the bass and spread, you're not supposed to spread sub bass because it like fucks up vinyl. I was like, no, I'm going to spread that.
Right. Yeah.
And, and so that for me, like getting that low end sounding heavy and wide was like probably that's the biggest change. And then the vocals kind of like, it was already heavy enough. And so when I started thinking of the lyrics and the sort of how the vocals were going to sound, it wasn't a what do you call a visceral tone. I wanted something that sounded like a nice lush analog synth with a little bit of delay. I didn't want to have the angsty, Beastland was heavy and in your face, and this album I wanted it to feel better. Yeah, I guess less cynical, like especially even from the lyrical point of view, like I wanted a little bit more I don't know, give some hope rather than fucking beat people down even more.
Yeah, man. Well, when it comes time to record an album in a studio, and it sounds like you had some hands-on engineering and even mixing this, but what are for this album even, what's sort of the ratio of maybe direct signals that might be triggering other MIDI instruments or versus like outputting like directly through a mic'd up speaker, more old school, so to speak, for tracking? Is there like a balance of those so you kind of get different sounds and sort of textures? Because it's like you said, it's such an intense, big, thick sound that sometimes, switching up those voicings, maybe via recording through a speaker, for instance, would switch that up. Is that something that you found on this record as well?
Absolutely. The tone that I have when I hit a key or I slide a key, depending on what kind of, it's kind of all the same thing. I've got about three different layered, like kind of triangle wave synths that have their own built-in, like this is like software. I used to do more analog stuff, but when you go on the road and take these analog synths out with you, it's a lot of hardware. And I was like, yeah, going through a big sound system, I can really replicate that with a good VST. So even though we did a lot of stuff on the album with the analog synths, a lot of it that I work with is straight off my computer. And then I have a subtone that really is targeted towards like below 100 hertz. Yeah. And that I have a separate like kind of knob for that, so I can turn that up and down. And then I split out some separate synths through like neural DSP plugins. I used to run those like on the Tool thing. I would run them out through some guitar cabs in the past. Like I would like have an Ampeg stack and a Marshall stack and then put a mic on them just to kind of give it that sort of like room tone, a little bit of like more air. Right. But I'm trying to make it so that I can have this be all within the box. So yeah, there's a couple things that are mic'd. I mean, it ended up being that John Coda, who's my sound guy right now, helped me mic these. We had like, I don't know, we mic'd probably 5 or 6 different cabs, and then we'd layer them into the tone. And I use a little bit of that live. So it pretty much sounds like that live. Nice. But the other thing is having a guitar player, Phil Scrazzo was my manager, who was also the guitar player in As I Lay Dying, who we've known each other for a long time. He did a lead on this. I think it was on Incinerator. And it turned out that he ended up just kind of saying, well, what about this? And he played on the whole song. And then it turned out that we had him play on the whole thing. Right. And his tone, we had to mess around with that because I don't, as a guitar player, I don't need him to cover the heaviness of the track. I just need him to add a little texture and then a lot of melody. So, that's kind of basically just like an HM2 heavy metal pedal. Right. And that really kind of adds a little bit of crunch to the low end. Gotcha. Yeah, it's interesting just thinking about the ways to layer it because, as I said, your sort of bass sounds or the fundamental sound is such a heavy, dense sonic experience that it would make sense that you'd kind of have to rethink the presence of a guitar, especially with heavy music, because you're already sort of providing so much heaviness, Yeah, and we don't want to. The good thing is these people know I've been established now. We're not starting a band from scratch. There's no like, they're there for a real purpose. And this album, the guitar stands out. And Phil couldn't tour with me because he's got his own band that draws a lot more people than I do. And so Doug Sabalik, who plays in Ecstatic Vision, is flying out actually tomorrow.
Wow.
We're going to rehearse for about 4 days before we go down to Mexico for the first show. So he'll be filling in, and he's a great guitar player.
Right. When you play shows in Europe or any of the other places overseas where you've mentioned, how are you getting your rig out there? Because it's not like you're building another one when you get there. So how does that thing ship?
I have different levels of, or different amounts of gear that I bring. I started out with the really big, heavy stuff that was more sculptural drone machines. And then I sort of, out of necessity, had to like scale that down because I was getting invites for shows and I couldn't go to Europe. The first one was actually Brazil. I got a kind of a more of an art show down there. Like, my wife's from there too. So we kind of made it into a family trip, and I said, fuck, I gotta like, you're looking at plane expenses and you're like, okay, 50 pounds, 62 linear inches. What's a reasonable, you can only really take this many 3 check bags before it starts to get ridiculously expensive.
Oh yeah.
And that's also like certain festivals will only pay so much. So
right.
That was like, I built my rig to fit in 3 Pelican cases at 50 pounds.
Oh my God. Crazy.
But on Tools Tour, I brought everything, like my old stuff, because they took it in their trucks. And so that was, although when I went to Australia, they weren't going to take it. So then I used the small setup. So there's different levels. And I actually prefer the small setup as much as I love spinning the 300-pound disc and things like that. It's
right.
The stress of getting it on the stage and all of that of affects you during the show. And so I try to keep it like the minimal, because then, people can only, especially in those venues, people can't see what the fuck you're doing up there.
Right. Totally. Oh my God. Well, man, yeah, you mentioned being out with Tool and everything, and it makes sense that you would work with some of the members of that band, because I remember when their record Anima came out in '96, the last song, Third Eye, has a section in the middle of it which almost sounds like a precursor of some of what you do with this kind of big industrial enveloping swell of a sound. But how was it working with those guys?
I mean, it was kind of a long time coming. We had some opportunities. Well, there was like talk of maybe some tour earlier on. It never happened because, they kind of reach out and are you available? And then ended up being Killing Joke. And then I think the time before it was somebody else, but Danny, I had known him through his wife. She has a kind of a festival up in Portland, Oregon called Stump Fest. And so sort of, and there's just a lot of, crossover with other bands like Dalek and Yob and other bands that they took out. And so, yeah, we just, eventually they took me out, and Adam Jones came to a show in LA that I was opening for Three Teeth, and he asked me if I was available. And so, yeah, I mean, it was pretty chill. After the first show, they asked me to do the Australia dates. They probably just wanted to make sure, I didn't do something extremely terrible the first night. So, yeah, it took me out. It was rad. And then the relationship, they were so chill on tour. Every night we would sit in Danny and Justin's green room and have some beers, and real chill guys. And then afterwards, both those guys agreed to contribute to the album. So we sent some files back and forth.
Awesome.
And we're still been in touch. I was trash talking with Justin yesterday about Liverpool beating Chelsea in the Carabao Cup.
Right. So. That's wild, man. In the interim of each record, I imagine there's some toying with different, triggers and routes and just whatnot, and exploring those aspects of your setup. But what is it that ultimately sculpts what becomes a song? I mean, is it a sound or series of sounds that you stumble across, or is it a sound or sounds that you hear in your head that you then have to facilitate into your own setup, or is it, I'd imagine it's probably both.
Yeah, it's been it's been a process. I mean, early on there was like 2 separate sides of Author and Punisher. There was sort of the droney side that the machines were on, and then there was like the programmed beats and the guitar stuff. And the albums, I would say, up through like Women and Children, were kind of like half and half. And then lately I kind of combined the 2 because now I can play the beats a little bit better. And so like there's the stuff that I play live, which is most of the drums. So like, and then my right hand will be playing like the kick, the snare, the hi-hat, the cymbals, and maybe some odd industrial kind of sounds. And my left hand will be playing a keyboard or an oscillator, one of the throttles or the rack and pinion, the things that I slide.
Yeah.
So that those two, my left and my right hand, sort of work in unison to make the core of the band, you know, the drums and the bass and the guitar. But then there's like, once I write that stuff, there's these other parts, you know, these kind of, I label them as like clangs and like sort of polyrhythms, and then also additional synth melodies and the guitar stuff that, well, I'm bringing the guitar along with me now to play, but there are some synth melodies that I don't have enough hands for.
Yeah.
So that's, and the same with the clangs that are like, you know, I make slow music because I can't move that fast. You know, I can't play blast beats. So I fill in some of that stuff with pre-sequenced material. And, you know, I have no qualms about that not being live. You know, I trigger the beginning and the end of those things, but so those, I kind of play along with those, and I have a click track. And so like when I choose those things, it's basically like I find all sorts of, on Beastland, it was like these Indian, like tribal, not American Indian, like actual Indian, you know, drum circle stuff where they would like play, and I can't remember the name of the instrument, but and then I would basically run them through the Octatrack, which is my Electron Octatrack sampler, and sort of like, and through the Analog Heat, which is this distortion box, and basically slow them down and mess with the pitch and find these like little sections that kind of had a nice rhythmic nature. And I would then sample those in loops and play over them and sort of come up with like, so it's, I don't know, it's kind of like that's the industrial component and I'm the band playing along with it.
Right.
That was Beastland. This album was a little bit more like, I had another sampler drum machine by Electron that I would program some beats in, and I got all these cymbals and clangs and then pitch them down and then run them through a little distortion box so they sound like, I don't know, so you can sort of hear the, I don't know, the texture of it. You know, like you know, so I'm hitting the kick and the snare and they kind of fill in the gaps.
Right.
A Centurion is a track where you really hear that on like the chorus. All I'm doing is hitting a kick and a snare that's kind of this like clanging polyrhythmic echo. So yeah.
Gotcha. I mean, it's interesting hearing you talk about it because from messing around with electronic music myself, it's one thing to press a button and hear some sort of digital corresponding sound or note. And it's another thing to sort of incorporate the physicality of engaging these sounds and triggering these sort of what I call sort of post-apocalyptic percussive explosions.
There you go. Yeah.
Why make that physical connection? I mean, is that just one side of being able to manipulate it in more of a tactile means that you feel more connected to?
That's one part of it for sure. I mean, when I was first coming up with this method of playing, it was like I was programming the stuff. You know, I was programming the beats and playing guitar along with it. But it had this sort of, I mean, the one mistake you can make is you can over program it. So it's way too clean and it's also way too perfect and you have too much going on. And you basically have this stereo output of a track of a whole bunch of stuff. And then you're just playing a guitar along with it. It's just sounded so inorganic. So I started to basically I made this thing, I could play the drums live. So then I was playing these, like my left hand, like playing keyboard or even tapping guitar with my left hand and playing the beats live. And it was really simple to start, just like a kick and a snare. And the beat fluctuated. So the BPM isn't stuck in this sort of really like this grid. You have this natural swing to it.
Right.
So like you're falling behind, you know, and especially with doom metal, you know, you kind of want to have that little, like when you hear Yob's drummer Travis play along with Mike and Aaron, it's like he drags it out, or like Neurosis.
Oh yeah. And
so for me, that was like, industrial music doesn't have that. And a lot of times when you go to these industrial festivals, everything is like, whoa, there's a lot of programmed beats going on here, you know?
Exactly.
So for me, that's what it was about. And then mixing in the pre-programmed stuff was like finding the points where you can add those pre-sequenced things where they don't overtake the mix. They're just accents. So like that was something that took a while to get.
I bet.
And actually, there's an issue when you're writing an album for me. Like you can over program a song and then you can't play it live.
Exactly.
And it's happened to me on a number of occasions. There's a track, Speaker Is Blown, on Beastland, that I didn't over program it, but I didn't really write it by just playing it. And so like when it was the most popular song on that album, you know, at least on Spotify.
Yeah.
And I can't play it. It just doesn't, it was perfectly like made for the album, but it wasn't a song that I wrote by playing. So now everything except for Blacksmith, for the most part, on the new album is like something I wrote and played and recorded it playing it.
That clarifies a few questions, because I was trying to think, if you have those more suspended big notes and you're not tied to a grid, then ultimately triggering something in time that's pre-recorded or sequenced, that's where things start to get super, super screwy. So it's sort of like going into it and recording it. You have to have your ability to then perform it on your own going forward, which kind of conversely affects the songwriting, I would think, you know?
Yeah, it's a weird thing. And now there's some points on the new album where we had like, obviously Danny Carey played on Misery.
Mm-hmm.
That's a tough thing to reproduce, because I made the decision to not sequence his drums for live. So the song is a little bit more simplified. It doesn't have these kind of things that he played, but it's okay, because that's what I sent him. And it's okay. It's basically like, maybe someday there'll be a guest drummer. I'll be playing with some band and I'll ask the drummer to come and join and kind of play what Danny had played. But there's 2 songs that have these tom kind of breakdowns. It's not the kind of thing I would play with my right hand. So like that'll be something that's sequenced, or maybe the guitar player will, you know, stand and play the toms.
Right.
So there are some moments where I'm making decisions like, okay, I'm going to sequence that, even though it's something that I could probably play, but I don't want to force it. So there might be moments where people are like, wait, you know, like I thought he'd be playing that live.
Mm-hmm.
But I have the things I like to play live, and I have the things that you know, everyone can just go fuck themselves.
Yeah, that's the end of the. You are the one man band in a sense. So yeah, it starts and ends with you. That's funny, man. Let's see. To my understanding, I mean, I know you're an engineer, which makes sense given again these sort of sonic tactile creations you've made. But at which point did you start learning maybe about circuitry and some of that stuff to connect the physical with whatever sonics you were looking for, or was that something that you were stumbling into as you were studying the engineering side of it?
I mean, it was in high school. You know, just sort of we did this. It was a really sort of geeky combination of drama and science called Odyssey of the Mind. It was called Olympics of the Mind at one point.
Okay.
Where it might still be around, but it was like a national competition that would start, you know, regionally between high schools and elementary schools, where you would there'd be a bunch of different, you know, I guess you would call them competitions, like 4 you could choose from. And one of them would be like, okay, take 5, you have 20 minutes to move tennis balls and these 5 different things. You have to build like a vehicle or a project, you know, thing that would shoot them, or but you would also have to have like a skit around it or something. And so we would spend a whole year or 6 months building all this stuff. It's kind of like hobbyist robotics. And so I did that every year for probably 12 years.
Gotcha.
Then when I got to college, it was like, oh, I'm going to do mechanical engineering and focus on like mechatronics and robotics. And we took the classes. And then there was, the one last thing I'll say is that there was an artist at the school, his name was Chris Csikszentmihalyi, and he was at RPI in upstate New York, where I went, and he was looking for engineers to help him on an art installation. And that's where I saw the posting, and I was like, oh, I want to do that. You know, I want to do something more creative with the engineering than just, I don't know, some industrial automation application. So
right.
He sort of opened my eyes to the fact that you can combine art and engineering.
Interesting. I mean, as far as the order of events for you, maybe just beyond that, was engineering a means for creating music, or was it sort of a byproduct of meeting this guy and then starting to think that maybe you could steer this engineering information in a sonic direction and then start developing it from there?
The music thing was always just hardcore bands. And then while I was in high school and college, sort of metal stuff, playing guitar and singing. And then the engineering was on the side. There was no connection. He had built like a DJ robot that took turntables and mixed the records. I wasn't a part of that project, but
Crazy.
well, he was teaching me how to use like microcontrollers to control motors and things like this. So I was more doing like sheet metal work and mechanical design for his installation. And he took me to Helsinki for this project, and like 2000, and I met a bunch of other artists, and I saw all these people building all sorts of cool like kinetic sculptures and robotic sculptures and things. And
wow.
So 4 years later, after I had worked in Boston as a mechanical engineer for a while, I reached out to a lot of those people that I had met at that show in Helsinki, who were basically professors at like different art schools across the country. So I tried to figure out where I was quitting engineering and going back to art school to work on sculpture. But I still didn't know it was going to be music. I still had a band in Boston. And so when I went to San Diego and started here, it was like my second year here after I failed at a bunch of sculptures that I was trying to build. Yeah. And ended up just building drum machines, because I was building like speakers and sound systems and everything I could do for my band. And I was like, well, what am I doing? Like,
yeah,
it was a weird culmination, like that moment where I figured out like, oh, I'm gonna build a sculpture that I control, that controls sounds. So
wow. It's interesting when I sort of think back to what I was starting to hear that was labeled as industrial, like in the 90s. I mean, I know obviously there was like Godflesh and Skinny Puppy, and 9 Inch Nails certainly conveyed some of those aspects. But I was fortunate enough to see Ministry in '92 at that Lollapalooza, and they were just incredible, man. I mean, do you have any connections or interest or any of that stuff with some of those maybe bands from the 90s? Were you able to see any of those bands live?
I never saw Ministry. I might have seen them at a huge festival, but I was, much more on I wouldn't say as much on the industrial side. I would say, Neurosis and Melvins.
Right.
And Godflesh for sure. Godflesh was my favorite band.
Crazy.
But the more sort of crossover into the EBM industrial world is not something I have as much of a connection with. I was much more like drum and bass, dubstep, like rave culture. That was much more my thing. And then the hardcore as well. So like Godflesh really, resonated with me because of the combination of like, he'd done some techno projects and mixed some of the dub and sort of drum and bass stuff that I liked. And then there was like Aphex Twin and Square Pusher.
Oh yeah.
That was a little more the direction. And then the breakcore and dubstep stuff of the 2000s, I absolutely loved.
Gotcha, man. With the darkness of your music, what might be some artists that would surprise your fans that you listen to? Because I mean, you mentioned that you have a wife. I too have been playing relatively heavy music that honestly drives her a little crazy. So I make sure when we're listening to music together, it tends to be yacht rock, just infinitely listening to yacht rock. I don't know what you listen to, so you don't drive your wife crazy in the house, but are there any artists that you're a fan of that is just in a completely different sort of world sonically?
Well, the stuff, especially like during the pandemic, but I've always, like I said, with dubstep and dub and reggae, like roots reggae, I listen to that stuff constantly. I mean, like on Friday afternoon when it's, work is out and I'm not in like tour prep mode and I'm just chilling, especially during the pandemic. It was like, I got really deep into all the like King Tubby and all this old, Reggie Miller and all this, original roots reggae from Jamaica, and then like old dubstep mixes from the UK, like, and then jungle mixes from the early 90s. All the, Portishead, Massive Attack, all that trip hop stuff. So that's kind of like the stuff that is the mellow stuff that we kind of listen to together. But as they get closer to tour and like with this album, I don't know why, as for whatever reason, as I envision myself getting back in like the club and with the album coming out and bands now releasing more stuff, I've just been listening to heavier stuff again. I guess like some bands that I like, Igor and Drum Corps,
Mm-hmm.
and Autark was a band that I found recently.
Nice.
Kind of the more people that are combining a lot of like programmed electronic stuff with heavy guitar work.
How do you balance having a real job and then with all the touring, man?
When I was working as an engineer in Boston, it was hard because I got out of school in 2001, and I stupidly left the band. I had a pretty good band there called Falkirk, and I really liked that band.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd been in the capital region of New York for a while, and I thought maybe I would go to Boston, closer to my home in New Hampshire. I went and worked at a subsidiary of Corning, which is like that fiber optic glass company. I was an automation engineer, like coming up with these ways to like automate the control of these little micro mirrors for switching fiber optics networks. And it was like
crazy.
I was in a bunny suit in a clean room and I had to go to work. Like it was like 9 a.m. until 8 p.m. And, all the things I loved about life were like from college and like going to hardcore shows and metal shows and raves. And
mm-hmm.
it was like few and far between, you do a couple of years of that, and all of a sudden, like, you're just shopping at the mall for your clothes, and you're not like your band t-shirts aren't around anymore, and you're not like, you start to lose like that part of you that you liked. I decided to go back to art school, and the thing is, now I'm an engineer again. But
right.
when I got out of art school, I by chance got an opportunity to work in this lab on campus, and that is a totally different vibe. So
right.
like working in a tech park for a giant company, whereas you're working for research that's funded by National Institute of Health, and it's research based, and it's on a campus with students, and there's things like there's protests here, and there's a union, and there's things about it that are much more in line with the way I think like work should be. And these people give me the freedom, and they know I'm an artist, and I take time without pay when I go on tour.
Gotcha. That's amazing you were able to balance it, man. That's as we all know, the older you get and all of the responsibilities and just life shit that creeps in makes it so increasingly hard to balance it. But that's awesome that you've found a way, and then ultimately some people to work for that allow you to do your thing and leave for those stretches, man.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the easiest thing on, there are times I'm probably not going to see my family until June, my parents on the East Coast, and
yeah,
it's tough. Sometimes it's tough on a relationship, but we get through it and do the things that we love.
I hear you, man. I don't know if you're a sci-fi fan, but I've been watching leading up to this interview. Interesting. It's bizarre the way that it timed out, but that series on HBO now, it's Raised by Wolves. Have you seen that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I've almost done with the first season.
Crazy. Yeah, that's funny that you're watching it, man. I was curious if you had seen it, because on one end I was like, man, I wish there were some Author and Punisher like soundscapes in this just to make the intense scenes that much more intense. It's pretty intense anyway, but I was watching it thinking that there was almost a correlation between what you do with Author and Punisher in the sense of sort of mankind's interaction with machines and how people evolved and or adapt in like dystopian situations, and just, if you have a machine that you interface with and they're doing some sort of an atheist colony or something, but then they've been programmed to empathize or emulate human qualities. Do they then start to show some of those qualities despite not being emotionally connected to them? I know that's probably a little more outside of the box maybe than what somebody would get sonically from what you do, but it's maybe just the sci-fi thing and the intensity and the darkness. I kept thinking of your music while I was watching it. It's funny that you've been watching it as well.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff is tough for me because I am a big sci-fi fan. It's not that I love technology, but there's certain things that I love about like mechanical devices and like good design and just tactile nature of stuff. And
mm-hmm.
I spend almost as much time getting my rig set up and just completely freaking out and researching like the simplest elements in my setup.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it's like, I don't think of it as like this really high tech setup. I feel like it's a pretty low fi, there's nothing robotic in what I do. It's
mm-hmm.
basically like me pushing levers.
Yeah.
it's a very organic thing. Whereas I feel like if somebody's got like some of the newest modular sequencers and stuff like that, that's pretty high tech in terms of like the AI, that is happening behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
So some of that stuff, like I'm also like a little bit bummed about engineering and science these days, because I sort of know deep in my heart that the solutions to the problems that we have are not going to be solved with engineering.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to be solved through like policy making and through like people in community, like doing things and making decisions. Whereas like, I think a lot of engineering schools and like professors and the whole industry, because it's run by, it's basically based on money,
of course,
thinks that they train people to think that they're doing a service to the community by coming up with ways to solve problems with engineering.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that if you look at like basic, I don't know, thermodynamics, like by making something, you're using energy, and like we can't just like engineer our way out of like all of the climate issues that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sad, because I think like from engineering, like you always think of like scientists and engineers like feel like they're like, oh, I can solve that problem, the Elon Musks and the Bill Gates. But like Bill Gates uses more energy than like anyone. His carbon footprint, it's like we are not going to solve those problems that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of bums me out, because like I'm an engineering guy.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I think it's cool. You can cure diseases. That's cool, and there are some great things we can do with engineering, but like sucking all the carbon out of the atmosphere is going to use a lot of energy. So it's like, why don't we just use less stuff and solve the problems that way? So for me, like, that's where I'm at.
I hear you. I mean, that question posed is the infinite human quandary, It's
right.
Such a big, massive, seemingly infinite question that is going to be answered throughout time. So we shall see, man. My God.
Yeah. It's a bummer. It's like we can spend all this money and like just say, hey, we're going to do this thing and we're going to solve this problem, or we could just spend all this time and like actually just communicate better from a policy making standpoint, which we're definitely not doing right now.
Right.
And that's kind of got me bummed out about engineering in general. And I think like there should be more focusing in schools about like, like the effects of what you're doing. There's analysis, like when you choose to do this and when you make this is what happens. These are the repercussions. This is what goes into it.
Yeah.
So
gotcha.
Anyway, enough about, I won't harp on that. It's not the most exciting topic.
No problem. I started it, man. It's no big deal.
Yeah.
Well, again, dude, congrats on Kruller, man. Again, I think it's a really cool record, and I think for someone that might be deterred by the intensity of some of the other stuff, I think there's a little bit of shimmering sort of different textures and melodies in this one that might pull some people in that might otherwise not be familiar with it, So I think it's actually a cool kind of progressive thing that you did with it. So congrats on that.
Thanks, man. I'm really excited to play. I have not played these songs live, and this Saturday and Tijuana is the first show. So look up all the dates, check them out. We're doing a little West Coast run, just about a week.
Sounds good. Well, man, Tristan, thanks for hanging with me, man. Again, congrats on the record, and best of luck on the tour, man. I hope to catch you out there blowing some systems out and making a big racket.
Yes, I will. I would definitely be blowing some sound systems up.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, man. All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Hope y'all enjoyed the convo. Definitely cool mixing it up and speaking to Tristan about the many processes that lead to this amazing one-man explosive sonic experience that he has absolutely developed, and just really cool visionary behind the whole thing. So super cool picking his brain about it all. Hope y'all enjoyed it, and we'll catch you on the next one. Crash, bang, boom.